All right, so we'll say good morning. Let's begin. So today's daf is Lamed Gimel. We left off actually on the top. Oh no, we didn't leave off on the top. Got excited there for a second. Yeah, not a chance. Okay, so we left off. We left off on Lamed Beis. Amud Beis. Actually, we have a lot to do today. All right. So remember again, we started with an interesting machlokes between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kafra. So the case we saw yesterday was in the case of the non-Kohen who went ahead and did the avoda on Shabbos. Rabbi Chia said he's chayiv shtein, he's chayiv twice. Once for going ahead and offering carbon as a non-Kohen. Number two for violating Shabbos through the avoda. And Bar Kafra said no, he's chayiv only once. So remember again, we left off Balmum, which is again, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 20, 23 lines up from the bottom of Lamed Beis Amud Beis. So remember, case number 2, Balmum Sheshimish Betuma. Let's say you have a Kohen who is blemished, who has a mum, who was also tamei, and he did the avoda. So we'll say, remember, so two things are happening over here. Number one, that he did avoda as a bal mum. That's issue number one. Number two, that he did avoda while he was tamei. So what is the halacha? Rabbi Chia says chayiv shteim. Rabbi Chia says you're chayiv twice. Once for doing avoda as a bal mum, and then the second time for doing avoda while you are in a state of tumah. Bar Kafra says, ein chayiv ela achas. You are only chayiv once. Kafas Rabbi Chia v'nishba. Rabbi Chia got up and he went ahead and he swore. Well, say just Shmuel is waiting for you. So our learning this morning is dedicated by Joshua and Rabin Karapkin. Joshua, who's Joshua? Shmuel and Rabin Karapkin. All right, maybe brother. Good. In memory of Rabin's mother Melanie Solomon, Pesa Mira Bas Chaim, and we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, her neshama will have an aliyah. So then the Gemara says, remember, so we'll say fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kafra. Rabbi Chia says you're chayiv shtayim. Bar Kafra says you're chayiv once. Kafatz Rabbi Chia v'nishba. Rabbi Chia got up and he swore ha'avoda. I swear, kach shamati me Rabbi shtayim. I swear that Rabbi taught me that you're chayiv twice. Kafatz Bar Kafra v'nishba. Bar Kafra got up and swore ha'avoda. I swear, kach shamati me Rabbi achos. You only chayiv once. So the Gemara says hischil Rabbi Chia ladon. So Rabbi Chia started to dash. Remember, Rabbi Chia is the one who says that you're chayiv twice. Tuma lakol ne'asra, right? So remember again, tuma, meaning the prohibition to go ahead and do avoda while you are tamei, is a prohibition that applies to everyone. Kishahutra b'mikdash, when it was permitted to go ahead and do it in the base of the Mikdash. I will say, what does it mean? Tuma was hutra in the Mikdash. For example, you are permitted to offer karbanos tzibur in a state of tuma. As we actually spoke about this before. Let's say the majority of the tzibur is tamei. There's a concept of tuma hutra, but tzibur for communal offerings, there are times that you could even offer when you are tamei. Kishahutra b'mikdash, eitzal kohanim timimim hutra kol kohanim timimim. Eitzal Kohanim Tamimim Hutra. It was only permitted for who? For regular Kohanim, unblemished Kohanim. The Kohanim Tamimim Hutra, below the Ba'ali Mumin. And remember, it was only permitted for the dispensation for Tumah was only permitted for regular Kohanim, but not for Kohanim who are Ba'ali Mumin. Yesh kan Ba'ali Mumin. V'yesh kan mishum tuma. Therefore, says Rabbi Chia, there is a double prohibition. Number one, because the Kohen did avodah while he was a Baal Mum. That's number one. Number two is that he did in a state of tuma. Therefore, you're going to be chayiv twice. Hischel Bar Kafra ladon. So our Kafra begins to dash, and he says, Tuma lakol ne'esra. Tuma, remember, to go ahead and offer in the base of Mikdash in a state of Tuma is also for everyone. Kisha hutra, b'mikdash hutra. I will say Bar Kafra's position is that once you find a dispensation for something, it becomes a categorical dispensation. So once there is the ability to offer karbanos in a state of tumah in the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, again, it's as if the prohibition of tumah is to a certain degree is hutra. So therefore, since there are possibilities in which tumah is hutra, therefore, ein kan ela mishum balmum. Therefore, says Bar Kafra, you will only be chayiv for offering as a balmum. Okay, that's case 2. Case 3. Zar sha'acha malika. That's another interesting case. Remember that there are bird offerings that are offered in the Beis Hamikdash that are offered in a very unique way called malika. So what does malika mean? You go ahead, the Kohanim would grow out their thumbnails. So you grow out your thumbnail, the Kohen would be holding the bird in his hand. He takes the bird is facing away from him. He takes his thumbnail, goes into the back of the neck, essentially again kills the bird with his nail, flicks off its head. That's called malika. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Kohen is permitted to eat that bird. Now, what's the novelty in that? The novelty in that is that there's no shchita, right? So again, technically speaking, if you were to try malika at home, aside from the other issues I would say you have if you try malika at home, right? But again, if you were to try malika at home, lemaisa, again, you can't eat that bird because that bird is a nevela. That bird is a nevela. Any animal that dies without proper shechita is called a nevela. So let's say you have a non-kohen who does malika and then he eats the bird. Rabbi Chia Omer chayiv shtayim. Rabbi Chia says you chayiv twice. Again, why? Once for a non-kohen doing the avoda, and number two for eating the vela. Bar Kafra Omer Bar Kafra says in chayiv ala achas, only chayiv once. Kafas Rabbi Chia ben Ish was the same thing. Rabbi Chia was jumping up and down and he swore ha'avoda kach shamati mi Rabbi shtayim. I swear that Rabbi taught me that you're chayiv twice. Kafas Bar Kafra ben Ish, Bar Kafra is jumping up and down and he said ha'avoda kach shamati mi Rabbi achas. I'm telling you, I learned from Rabbi that you're only chayiv once. Hischol Rabbi Chia ladun. So Rabbi Chia began to darshan nevela lekol ne'esra. Nevela is asr for everyone. Right, there's an issue nevela that is upon every person. Kisha hutra b'mikdash eitzal kohanim hutra. Excuse me. Kisha hutra b'mikdash eitzal kohanim hutra. Lekohanim hutra v'lo lezarim. The only time nevela is permitted is when is in the Beis Hamikdash and for kohanim. But it's only kohanim who have that dispensation. No one else does. Therefore, yesh kan mishum zaros, v'yesh kan mishum malika. Therefore, there are two prohibitions that he's incurring over here. One is because he is a non-kohen who's doing avodah. That's number one. And number two, he's eating nevela. His chil bar kafra ladun. So bar kafra begins the darshan. He says nevela lechol nesra. In reality, again, nevela is usher to everyone. However, kisha hutra b'mikdash hutra. The laws of nevela don't apply in the Beis Hamikdash, which means that once the Torah said that you could eat the bird nevela in the Beis Hamikdash, so Bar Kafra is suggesting that lemaisa, it means that prohibition in general does not apply in the Beis Hamikdash, independent of whether or not the malika itself is a good malika. Therefore, he's not going to be chayiv for malika. However, he will be ein kan ela mishum zaros. But he will be chayiv for what? For being a non-kohen, ultimately, again, who does the avodah. So we'll say, interestingly enough, what you see according to Bar Kafra is Bar Kafra seems to feel that in any situation where there is a Beis HaMikdash dispensation, even if someone else does that act, even though they're not a Kohen, they will not be chayiv for that act. They'll be chayiv for the secondary act that always applies, but for the act that is technically almost permitted in the temple, according to Bar Kafra, it almost becomes categorically permitted, even if a non-Kohen does it, and therefore they'll only be chayiv once. According to Rabbi Chia, not true. The fact that certain acts are permitted in the Beis Hamikdash, they're only permitted within a certain context. For example, if a Kohen does it, but if a non-Kohen does it, then ultimately, again, there's no permission for that act, and therefore they'll be chayiv. But my community, what are they arguing about? Says the Gemara, Be'isr kolel va'alibud Rabbi Yossi. They're arguing about an Isser Kolel. Also, remember, we spoke about this yesterday a little bit. An Isser Kolel is a secondary prohibition that has a wider reach than the first. Meaning, we spoke about yesterday two different things. We spoke about Isser Mosif. An Isser Mosif is, let's say you have Isser A, Isser number one, and then you have a secondary Isser, and that secondary Isser is more stringent or adds on some additional dimension than the first. Not everyone, but many agree that second Isser will be chal on the first. What about an Isser Kolel? Isser Kolel, the secondary Isser, is no more chomer than the first, but what? It applies to more people. It has a greater reach. So what are they arguing about? With an Isser Kolel, according to Rabbi Yossi, I'll say look at Rashi, Valibud Rabbi Yossi, Da'amar B'shar Isurei, Isser Chal al Isser al Yedei Migos. Remember, Rabbi Yossi holds that by regular Isurim, we hold of Isser Chalal Isser, that one prohibition could go ahead and set in even when another one is already in existence. Let's play this out. Rabbi Chia holds like this. Rabbi Chia Savar, Rabbi Yossi be'Isser Kola Mechayev Tarti. Rabbi Chia holds that according to Rabbi Yossi, even in a case of an Isser Kola, a secondary Isser with an expanded reach, we will say Isser Chalal Isser, and therefore if you commit both Isurim, you will be chayiv twice. Bar Kafra savar lo mechayiv elachada. Right? Bar Kafra, on the other hand, holds that no, that according to Rabbi Yossi, even though he holds Isser Chalal Isser, in a case of Isser, when do we say Isser Chalal Isser according to Rabbi Yossi? Meaning, in Bar Kafra's interpretation of Rabbi Yossi's position that Isser Chalal Isser, when is that true? That's true ultimately again in the case of Isser Mosif, where the second Isser adds on something, but if the second Isser doesn't really add on anything in terms of severity, just has a wider reach, then no, Rabbi Yossi will not hold Isser Chalal Isser, and therefore you'll only be chayiv once. Umay Isser Kolel Ikahacha. So let's analyze this. What is the Isser Kolel? What is the secondary Isser that has a greater reach in all three of these cases? Let's analyze this. Bishlam Azar Meikara Shari B'Malacha V'Aser Ba'Avoda. So we'll say, remember, case number one was where the non-Kohen did Avoda on Shabbos. There are two things that are happening over here. Number one, he's a non-Kohen is doing Avoda. That's number one. Right? Number two, he's violating Shabbos through the commission of the Avoda, through the actual Avoda itself. Fine. So the Gemara says, therefore, let's analyze this. So remember, at first, a non-Kohen is permitted in Malacha, v'aser ba'avoda, meaning, let's say during the week, a non-Shabbos case. So if a non-Kohen walks into the Beis HaMikdash and wants to go ahead and do the Avoda, he can't do the Avoda, but he's permitted to do Malacha. It's a weekday. Asya Shabbos. Now Shabbos comes along. Migo de Mr. b'malacha, Mr. Nami ba'avoda. Since Shabbos comes along and makes him asar b'malacha, Shabbos also makes him asar ba'avoda. So the Gemara is saying is like this: in the case of the zar she'asa avoda, what was the first isser he had? What was the first prohibition he had? First prohibition was avoda, was being a zar, right? Because remember, for 6 days out of the week, I have an isser of avoda, not an isser of malacha. So the assumption is, again, the first issue I have is that I'm a non-Kohen, I can't do avoda. Fine, that isser is there. Shabbos comes along, and Shabbos adds on an additional isser. Now, the truth is, Shabbos is restricting even something more than avoda did. Because avoda says that what? Avoda says that I can't do avoda. What does Shabbos say? What does Shabbos say? I can't do malacha. Malacha is more than even just avodah. Malacha is everything. So therefore, again, once Shabbos comes to go ahead and aser me in malacha, Shabbos also adds what? An additional dimension of prohibition upon what? Upon avodah. Therefore, using this logic, Rabbi Chia would say that Lamaisa, you would be chayiv twice. You'd be chayiv twice. So the Gemara says, next case. I skipped. Ba'amum. We'll say, what was the second case? Ba'amum, a blemished Kohen who goes ahead and does the avodah. So we'll say, remember again, it was actually a bigger problem than that. This was a Ba'amum who is tamei. So, right, two issues over here. Kohen is disqualified on two accounts. Number one, he's blemished. Number two, he's tamei. Two reasons he can't do the avodah. So remember again, what do we say in this case? So the Gemara says, Me'ikara shari ba'achila v'asar ba'avod. Now remember again, at first, before he's tamei, he is permitted to eat. Because remember again, even a kohen who's a Baal Mum is permitted to eat sacrificial. He can't do avoda, but he's permitted to eat sacrificial items, karbanos. So when he was a Baal Mum at first, so therefore what? He's permitted to eat, but he's not permitted in avoda. Itmila. Then what happens? Rabbi saying he becomes tamei. Migo de Mr. ba'achila, Mr. nami ba'avoda. So we'll say, what happens when he becomes tamei? So the Tumah now goes ahead and forbids that which he was prohibited to do. That which he was permitted to do. He was permitted to eat as a Baal Mum. Tumah comes along and says that what? Now he can't even eat. Bless you. Once Tumah says that he can't eat, what else does it aser? It also asers the avodah. As well, so you see what the Gemara is doing over here? That once you have a secondary prohibition that prohibits something new, that prohibition will also extend to what? To the other act as well. So for example, over here, I'm a kohen who's a Baal Mum, and I'm tamei. The assumption is I was a Baal Mum first before I became tamei. Therefore, as a Baal Mum, I can't do avoda, but I could eat. I become tamei now. What does Tumah do? Tumah prohibits my ability to eat. I can no longer eat. Once Tumah prohibits consumption, therefore Tumah will also go ahead and devolve upon what? My ability to go ahead and do avoda. Even though I already couldn't do avoda because I was a Baal Mum, now there's a secondary reason I can't do avoda also because I'm now tamei. Ella Malika b'ba'asachasi. But the problem, of course, you get into is in the case of Malika, because they're both say in the previous two cases, the reason I can set up these cases of a secondary prohibition coming along and including the first is why? Because the secondary prohibition occurs at a later time than the first. But in the case of Malika, essentially, again, everything happens at once. Why does everything happen at once? Well, I'll say, because remember, look at Rashi. Ela Malika, kola lo mishkachas la, da b'shas Malika chayli tarvayu. The chol's manch, because remember again, what happens on Malika? The moment that I do the malika, that's when I've done the avoda, and that's also what? That's when it becomes an avela, right? So everything is happening at the same time. Chayli tarvayu, t'cholzman she, I'm reading Rashi, t'cholzman shel nimlika, haya aleha isra me'ila, v'lo zehu isra zaros ha'omer bekarban shenitra la'achilas kohanim, ukishenimlika v'niras l'kohanim, paka mine isra azharas me'ila, v'chayla le isra zaros, tizar lo yochal, v'isra malika v'isra basachos. So when it comes to malika, everything happens at once. The Gemara says, "D'mishkachas be'isr kola l'mishkachas la." Therefore, there is no case of isr kola, of a secondary isr, adding on an additional dimension to malika. Ella, so therefore, again, both says, remember, the Gemara wanted to suggest that lemaisa, what Bar Kafra and Rabbi Chia were arguing about was in the position of Rabbi Yossi about whether or not Isser Kolel works, whether or not we say Isser Chalal Isser in an Isser Kolel. Now we would just establish is that logic works for 2 out of the 3 cases, but for the 3rd case you can't see it. Now therefore we have to go back to the drawing board and try to figure out what Rabbi Chia and Bar Kafra are arguing about. Ella, kamiflagi be'isser bebasachas. Well, say listen to this. Rather, what are they arguing about? They are arguing about simultaneous prohibitions, va'alibud Rabbi Yossi, and still in Rabbi Yossi holds Isser Chalal Isser. Now we'll say, now what does this mean? Rabbi Chia Savar, Rabbi Chia holds Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Chia holds the following: Be'isser basachos mechayve tarti. That when you have 2 prohibitions, Rabbi say, that occur simultaneously, you are chayiv twice. Ubar Kafra Savar lo mechayiv elachada. Bar Kafra, on the other hand, holds that no, when you have 2 simultaneous prohibitions, you are only chayiv once. V'hacha ma'isr bas achas ika. And here, what is now? So again, remember. So what the Gemara now is suggesting is machlokes Bar Kafra and Rabbi Chia is in simultaneous prohibitions. If I do an act that results in 2 simultaneous violations, am I chayiv once or am I chayiv twice? Rabbi Chia says twice. Bar Kafra says once. Now both say now, in order for this explanation to work, remember what has to happen. You have to be able to plug it into the 3 cases we mentioned on Lamed Beis, Amud Beis. Let's go through this. So let's analyze this. So the Gemara says, Zar Shish. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, Zar Shishimish b'Shabbos. So we'll say, so what's the case? Remember, we have the non-Kohen who did avodah on Shabbos. Remember again, he's violating 2 things. A, he's a non-Kohen, and B, is violating Shabbos. So both say, how can you have this situation of basachas? This is interesting. Kigon da'isi shtei sa'aros b'Shabbos, where he displays 2 hairs, two pubic hairs, as a sign of physical maturation and therefore his entry into adulthood on Shabbos itself. And I both say, so what's the chap of this? Look at Rashi; it's actually very interesting. 2nd wide line in Rashi. Kigon da'isi shtei saros hayom. B'Shabbos zu dahashta lekalaneimar kidle el meikar sharbi malacha v'aser ba'avoda daha lo chal shum Israel ad hayom the Isser Zaros the Isser Shabbos yachad bo. Both say, listen to this. It's very interesting. You see, in the previous case, remember we said that the prohibition of a zar was first, and then Shabbos comes along later on. If he becomes an adult on Shabbos, then what happens? Both prohibitions devolve upon him simultaneously, right? And because remember, if he brings these 2 hairs, if he becomes a gadol, essentially on Shabbos, that means again that the prohibition to violate Shabbos and the prohibition to do avodah if he's a non-Kohen occur simultaneously. Therefore, if he were to go ahead and now do a prohibited act on Shabbos, he would simultaneously violate A, being a zar, a non-Kohen, and B, violating Shabbos. So I will say, this is a little bit different than the way we normally think about simultaneous violation. But the way the Gemara is understanding it over here is that both prohibitions devolve upon him at the same time. When he becomes a gadol on Shabbos, the prohibition, if he's not a Kohen, to do avodah, and the prohibition of violating Shabbos occur upon him on the same time. So therefore, again, when he acts upon that, there are 2 simultaneous violations that are incurred. So the Gemara says next, Balmum. Remember again, we'll say case number 2 was the Balmum who is Tameh, who does avodah. Balmum who is Tameh, who does avodah. So how can you have simultaneity in this case? So the Gemara says, Nami kagon da aisi shtei saros v'itmilei. So we'll say again, very simple. It could be the same exact idea. Look at Rashi. Balmum kigon da aisi shtei saros v'itmilei. Kilomar de itmi kodem beis saros ubesoch tum asa umumo hevi shtei saros ubisha'as haba'at chalushneim sheishnehu tluyin alav. So it's actually very interesting. So the simple understanding of it is that he becomes tamei at the moment that he displays signs of physical maturation, and therefore again, Rabbi say in that case, obviously the mum was there already. So now he's a bal mum and he becomes tamei at the same time. Okay, the Havli Balmum. Rashi has a little bit of a different interpretation of it. Rashi explains that it could be that he was exposed to the tumah beforehand. But the fact that he's a Balmum does not become meaningful ultimately again until he becomes a gadol. I will say, but again, I just think it's simpler to say that Lamaisa could be that he's mamish being exposed to tumah at the moment that he displays signs of physical maturity. In which case, Lamaisa again the tumah as well as the balmum kite develop upon him at the same time. Inami, I will say here's actually a simpler case. Shechatach etzba'o besakin tneya. All right, it's not pleasant, but it works, right? Which is what? Where he cuts off his finger with a tamei knife. So say if he cuts off his finger with a tamei knife, then what is he doing? There's simultaneity. What's the simultaneity? He's becoming a balmum. And remember, the tamei knife could communicate tumatim, and that's all happening at the same time. Bishlama l'Rabbi Chia ki asne l'didei aliba d'Rabbi Yossi ki asne l'Bar Kafra aliba d'Rabbi Shimon. The Rabbi say, according to Rabbi Chia, remember Rabbi Chia was the one who holds that in these cases of simultaneity you're going to be chayev twice. So Rabbi Chia's position makes sense. Why? Because you could say, remember, he's going according to Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi holds isser halal isser, and therefore you could be chayev twice. However, Bar Kafra seems to go ahead and be reflecting the view of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon does not hold of isser halal isser, even if it's basachos. He does not hold that one prohibition could develop upon another, even when there is simultaneity. El Bar Kafra, Rabbi Chia shekuri kamashaker. But according to Bar Kafra, does he think that Rabbi Chia is lying about what Rabbi said? That Rabbi said Yechayev twice. Ella, the Gemara says, kamifligi be'isser basachos. Rather, it must be that both Rabbi Chia and Bar Kafra agree with the notion of Rabbi Shimon that Isser Chalal Isser. What's their fundamental dispute? Is Isser Chalal Isser bebasachos? Does Isser Chalal Isser if both prohibitions are simultaneous? Bishlam Rabbi Chia Kamishtaba La'afuke Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon Chazake. So according to Bar Kafra, according to Rabbi Chia, I understand that ultimately, why does he swear that Rabbi told him that Shechayev twice to go ahead and uproot Rabbi Shimon from his position? Meaning that lest you think that that even though Rabbi Shimon holds Isser Chalal Isser, perhaps he doesn't hold it by Basachas, and therefore Rabbi Chia is coming along to say, I swear that Rabbi told me that Isser Chalal Isser, even Basachos. El Bar Kafra, but according to Bar Kafra, what does Bar Kafra need to swear? To which the Gemara says, Kasha. You know what? That is a good question. So the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, Bishlam Bar Kafra, ki asniye Rebbe lididei aliba d'Reb Shimon. Now, according to Bar Kafra, I'll say it makes sense because when Rebbe ultimately stated his own position, he was stating it in accordance with Rabbi Shimon, who holds Isser Chalal Isser. Ki asal Rabbi Chia, and yet again, when Rabbi Chia taught his position, aliba d'Rabbi Yossi, it was teaching it according to Rabbi Yossi, who holds Isser Chalal Isser. Rabbi Shimon holds Ein Isser Chalal Isser. El Rabbi Chia Bar Kafra Shakuri Kamashakar. According to Rabbi Chia, is Bar Kafra lying? Omer Rabbi Chia ki asnei Rebbe lididei tarti liftar. So when Rebbe was teaching this din to Bar Kafra, he was teaching Bar Kafra that there are two cases in which you are exempt. Tarti liftar asniye v'isser amud beis v'isser kolal asniye. So I'll say, so now Rabbi Chia is suggesting that when Rebbe taught Bar Kafra these halachas, so Rebbe taught Bar Kafra the following. He taught Bar Kafra that there are two cases, there are two cases in which you have to paskin that they are permitted, and Isser Kola Asni, and he taught him ultimately again about the concept of Isser Kola. Look at Rashi. Rashi says Isser Kola Asni, top of all, Lamed Gimel Amud Beis. Kilomar hechi di isrami al yidei kolel asnion Rebbe Petura va'alibu de Rebbe Shimon. So also remember, so the Gemara is suggesting over here is that when Rebbe taught that lemais again you could be patur for the second prohibition, that's talking about again with an isser kolel. An isser kolel, meaning an isser that's not necessarily more severe but has a greater reach, and that's in accordance with Rabbi Shimon who holds in isser chalal isser. Vehecha di isramu b'bas achos asnion chayuva. Aval Malika lo asni liftor klal de lo mashkech la bikodel elabas achos. So we'll say again. Remember that third case, which is Malika, we pointed out before, cannot be taught really as an Isser Kolal case, but rather that's only a bas achos case. So the Gemara says, "V'alibus Rabbi Shimon v'chazi leBar Kafra." Bar Kafra, however, what did he do? He looked at the case of Lizar Sha'achal Malika. He looked at the case of the Zar, the non-Kohen, who did Malika and then ate the nevela, ate the bird, and he said to himself like this: "Va'aidi dedamya lei arva bahadayu." And since in Bar Kafra's estimation, the case of Malika resembled the other two cases, he included it in all three, even though again the first two are really separate than the Malika case. And the chiddush of this is Bar Kafra did this even though he did not hear this directly from Rebbe. Va'ayin ba. And then upon further contemplation, Bar Kafra realized that the only way to set up the Malika case is in a case of basachas, in a case ultimately again where everything is occurring simultaneously. V'savar midahava basachas, and he assumed that since the Malika case only occurs in a basachas case, hachanami basachas, so to the other cases, the other two cases, the previous two cases, must also be basachas, umedahanach liftar, and the same way ultimately again that those cases were pater from the second prohibition. Hanach nami lifter. So to this case of Malika should also be pater as well. Okay. Meses. The one raises the kasha. Zar sheshimish b'shabes ubal mum sheshimish b'tuma. Yesh bo mishum zaros umishum shabes umishum bal mum umishum tuma. Div Rabbi Yossi. So, what does the Brisa say? If you have a non-Kohen who did avoda on Shabbos, or you have a Baal Mum who went ahead and did the avoda while in a state of deficiency, in a state of having the Mum, what does the Raisa say? You're chayiv for being a non-Kohen who does avoda, you're chayiv for violating Shabbos, you're chayiv for being a Baal Mum, and you're chayiv for Tumah. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shimon says, Ein kan elam mishum zaros, ubal mum bilvad. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, says that what? You're only chayiv for zaros, which means again you're chayiv for being a non-Kohen who does the avoda, and you're chayiv for being a balmum. We both say, so what's happening over here? Rabbi Yossi holds you chayiv for everything. And remember, that's not a chiddush, because Rabbi Yossi holds what? Isser chal al isser. That one prohibition could go out and devolve upon another. Therefore, again, even though I'm already a zar, I can still be chayiv for violating Shabbos. And even though I'm already a balmum, I can still be chayiv for doing avodah instead of tumah. On the other hand, Rabbi Shimon holds that what are you chayiv for? Only for the first prohibition you encounter. But you are not. But we say ain't isser chalal isser. Therefore, you will not be chayiv for subsequent prohibitions. So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Omer ain't kan elam mishum zaros ubal bum bilvad v'ilu melika shaira. But interestingly enough, Malika is left out, right? Meaning, why? So we'll say what happened over here is something very interesting. This Brisa quotes two of the three cases we mentioned on Lamed Beis Amud Beis, right? It mentioned the Zar, the non-Kohen who did avoda on Shabbos. It mentioned the Balmum who did avoda b'tumah, but yet what? It left out the Zar who did Malika. Why did it leave out the Zar who did Malika case? So the Gemara says, Ilema the Rabbi Yossi. Now, if you say you left out because Rabbi Yossi, that can't be. Hash Rabbi Yossi be'isr kola mechayiv shtayim be'isr ba'asachas mibai. Then I will say, listen to this. If Rabbi Yossi holds that you're chayiv twice, for what? You're chayiv twice for an Isser Kola, right? When one Isser builds upon the other in a successive progression. If Rabbi Yossi even holds that you're chayiv twice for an Isser Kola, he certainly holds that what? That you're chayiv twice for an Isser Basachas, when the two Issurim occur simultaneously. Now, so you've already established on Amud Aleph that the case of Malika is a case of Isser Basachas, where both Issurim are occurring simultaneously. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, the case of Malika should definitely be included. Ella lav the Rabbi Shimon. Rather, it must be according to Rabbi Shimon. Ubi isra kolel hu depater, aval be isra bas achas mechayiv. And according to Rabbi Shimon, it's only in a case of isra kolel. It's only in a case of successive isurim that Rabbi Shimon holds that you're pater. Meaning, but if they occur simultaneously, even Rabbi Shimon would agree that what? Even Rabbi Shimon would agree that lamaisa, you would be chayiv twice. I'm sorry. That it's only according to in Rabbi Shimon. When does he say that ein iser halal iser? That's when Rabbi said that's an iser kolo. When there are two successive isurim. However, again, if the isurim occur at the same time, then lemaisi even Rabbi Shimon would agree that you are chayiv twice. Therefore, the Gemara says tiyufta the bar kafra tiyufta. This effectively refutes the position of bar kafra. It effectively refutes the position of bar kafra. And Rabbi said, just so you should know. L'maisa, the way we paskin in this sugya is we really do paskin like Rabbi Chia, that in these cases you would be chayiv twice. Now again, the way the Rambam qualifies this ruling is, first of all, we're talking about over here in two things. First of all, we pass like Rabbi Chia in both accounts. Namely, number one, if it's Isser Kolal, right? And even if again, well, let's work backwards. You're chayiv twice b'basachos. If you go ahead and you violate one act that brings with it two prohibitions, you would be chayiv twice. Now, remember, when we speak about being chayiv twice, what does being chayiv twice actually mean? So being chayiv twice, let's say if you did the acts accidentally, let's say again I'm a non-Kohen who does avod in the Beis Hamikdash, and I forgot, I didn't know two things. Number one, I didn't know that a non-Kohen can't do avod in the Beis Hamikdash, and I didn't know that you can't do avod on Shabbos. Let's say I didn't know those two things. So I did chayiv twice, meaning two carbon chatos, two karbanos. That's in the case of basachos. We also paskin like Rabbi Chia in a case of Isser Kolal. Even if they are successive Isurim, even if the second Isser is not more severe than the first, it just has a broader reach, we also hold that you are chayiv twice. So we hold like Rabbi Chia across the board. So the Gemara goes weiter. Actually, we're not finished this yet. So the Gemara says the following. Zar sheshimish b'Shabbos b'Hayin. I will say now the Gemara goes back and analyzes this case a little bit. So the Gemara says when we spoke about the case of the non-Kohen who does avoda on Shabbos. So remember again, so we had Rabbi Chia who says that you're chayiv twice. Bar Kafra said you're chayiv once. So what exactly is it that you have done, right? B'mai, what malacha has the zar performed on Shabbos? Ibishchita, if you want to say he shechted a karban, that can't be an issue of zaros. Why not? Because shchita bizar kshera. Remember, what is the halacha? In general, again, shchita need not be done by a kohen. Shchita can be done by a non-kohen as well. So if it's shchita, that wouldn't be an issue. Remember also, when we speak about zaros refers to the prohibition of a non-kohen doing avoda. So it can't be talking about shchita because shchita can be done by a non-kohen. V'i bekabbalah v'halacha. So maybe you're going to say it's the receiving of the blood and the transporting of the blood to the Mizbeach. That can't either. Why? Because that's tiltul ba'ama. You can't call that real avoda. That's just movement. That's just carrying. So the Gemara says, I if you want to refer to the fact that he burned the offering on the Mizbeach, let's listen to this. V'amar Rabbi Yossi says, Havara lelav yatzasa. Remember again, we've had this a number of times already, that the Torah on one hand says, you can't do any malacha, and then the Torah singles out, that you can't kindle a fire. There's a big machlokas as to why kindling was singled out. So was it singled out to teach us that you are chayiv for every single malacha you do on Shabbos, or the lav yatzasa? There is a position that holds, there's Rabbi Yossi who holds that even though for all other malachas, if you do them on Shabbos, you'll be chayiv a death penalty. However, when it comes to kindling a fire, if you did it, it's only violating a lav. So therefore, again, I can't say that I've violated Shabbos with havara, because all that is according to Rabbi Yossi is just simply a lav. So what's the case? Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov. B'shchitas paro shel kohen gadol. So also, what are we talking about over here? We're talking about what did the zar shecht? This guy went for the gold, right? He didn't just shecht any carbon. He shechted the par of the kohen gadol. The power of the kohen gadol. And I will say, when is that? Watch this. That gets better, by the way. What's the power of the kohen gadol? B'yom Kippurim. Wow. Right? Mamish. Like this guy. I don't know how he's like a streaker. I don't know how he got in here. Right? You know, he jumped off the stands over here. He ran into the Beis Hamikdash with knife in hand. He's like that nut who started this whole thing in the soccer stadium in Eretz Yisrael 2 days ago. We saw this on the news. Right? There was this guy, whatever, it's not important. In any event. So what happened? Mamish. So this guy runs out, he runs from the bleachers of the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur and shechts the power of the Kohen Gadol. On Shabbos, by the way, right? It's Yom Kippur, Shabbos, and he runs and he shechs the power of the Kohen Gadol. So what happens? So the Gemara says, oh yes, so in that case, bizarre psula. So we'll say that's one case where everyone agrees that what? Where although normally shchita of karbonos does not require a kohen, the par of the kohen gadol of Yom Kippur absolutely requires a kohen. That's part, meaning that's part of the kohen gadol's avoda. So that would be a case of zars. Ihachi, my area zar, I feel a kohen hedyotami. The truth is, I will say, if that's the case, that you're setting up the case over here now as the part of the kohen gadol on Yom Kippur, that's just not a non-kohen. Even a regular kohen is not permitted to go out and do that. To which the Gemara says, my area zar, I feel a kohen hedyotami. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Shezar etzlo ka'amar. You're right. In this context, zar does not have to be a non-kohen. Zar means anyone who is alien to this avoda. Anyone. So in this case, now that we're setting it up, dealing with the part of the kohen gadol, it could be that a Yisrael shechted it, or it could even be that a regular kohen shechted it, and the case would be the same. Essentially, someone shechted a carbon that they were not permitted to shecht. Therefore, again, you can't call it avoda. You have to call it malacha. So there's a dual prohibition. A, it was a zar who did it, non-kohen did it, or a regular kohen did it. And number two, therefore, it's a malacha. So the Gemara says, therefore, the Gemara all the Gemara was just trying to do was trying to shed clarity on that case. The machlokes is still the same. Rabbi Chia would say you'd be chayiv twice. Bar Karfa would say you'd be chayiv once. So the Gemara says, Maskif la Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi raises a kasha. Now, what's Rav Ashi's problem over here? So Rav Ashi's problem look at Rav Ashi. So the Gemara says, Maskif la Rav Ashi, midi chataos katani, olavi katani, eli isuri ba'alma kachashiv, lemay nafkamina. So I'll say, Rav Ashi goes all the way back. And remember again, when Rabbi Chia says you're chayiv twice, or Bar Kafra says you're chayiv once, so Rav Ashi says, what are they talking about? You're chayiv what? Are we talking about over here? Why don't they use the lashon of chatos? So also remember, when would you bring a chatos? When they bring a carbon chatos? If you violate something accidentally. So why don't they phrase, the nature of their machlokas is, you'd be chayiv to chatos, or you'd be chayiv to lavim. Right? Why don't they go, all they say, or in their lashon in the machlokas is, chayiv shtaim or chayiv achas. What are you chayiv over here? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you the Gemara says, "L'may nafkamina lekovra bein rishon Gemara." Remember, we had this yesterday as well. That lemaisa again, lemaisa, Bar Kafra and Rabbi Chia don't phrase their machlokis in terms of chatos. Rather, they just refer to it. They just discuss it in terms of isurim. So what's the nafkamina? What's the practical difference if you're chayiv once, you're chayiv twice? As I tell you what the practical difference is, as we spoke about yesterday. If you are executed by the Beis Din because of your infraction, let's say a person did this intentionally, and therefore they'd be executed again for this violation, where are you buried? Remember again, if you say that for this double act you're only chayiv once, then the Maisa again, okay, you get executed, but you could be buried in a cemetery of the not so bad guys. However, again, if your act resulted in a dual infraction, right, which means you intentionally violated two things, then the Maisa again, that's called the Rasha Gomer. And if you're a Rasha Gomer, you are buried in a special cemetery for a Sha'im Gemurin. Okay, so it says in Shabbos again, as I stated before, Halach Lamaisa we paskin like Rabbi Chia, and in a case of an act that ultimately carries with it that has two prohibitions, whether those prohibitions aren't Isser Kola, one after the other, or those prohibitions are Babasachas, one will be chayiv twice for the act. Says the Mishnah. We'll say another case, a very interesting case actually. Shnaim shekitchu shtei nashin, two men, so married two women. Ubishas knisasan lechupa hechlifu eshal zet lezeh ve'eshal zet lezeh. So don't ask how. The how is irrelevant, right? What happens? Two men marry two women, and their wives get mixed up. Now, I will say, in all actuality, we will discuss exactly what the nature of the situation over here, right? So their wives get mixed up with each other. So what's the halacha? So meaning we're not sure exactly who it is that's married to who. So what happens? And I will say, again, the assumptions we're going to see, by the way, we'll see this more in Ksuvas, but knisasan lechuppah doesn't just mean that simply standing under the chuppah. Because the chuppah means that yichud, and ultimately they had relations. So what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Hare elu chayavim mishum eshes ish. So I'll say, obviously, again, they are both chayiv for the act of adultery. Now, obviously, we're going to have to define what that means. What that means that they're chayiv for adultery, but eshes ish. And furthermore, v'im hayu mishum, v'im hayu achin, and ultimately, if the two men were brothers, mishum eshes ach. Not only would they be in violation of adultery, but what? They'd also be in violation of having relations with one's brother's wife. V'im hayu achayos, and if these women were sisters, now not only would they be chagaja, not only would they be chayiv for adultery, not only would they be chayiv for a brother's wife, but what else? Mishum eisha elachosa. They'd also be chayiv for what? They'd also be chayiv for a wife's sister, and it gets better. V'im hayu nidos, and if both of the women were nidos, then what? Mishum nida, you'd be chayiv for nida. Umafrishin osan shlosha chadashin. Now I will say, now this is actually very interesting. Rashi says over here like this. So let's say you're able to straighten out who is married to who. Now I will say, we'll discuss in obviously there's a lot of blanks we have to fill in this case over here. But let's say you're able to straighten out. So what is the halacha? We wait 3 months. We separate the husband and wives from each other for 3 months, right? Mafrishin also shlosha chadashim shema mu'ubaros hein. Because I will say again, if they accidentally mixed up who is married to who, and each man lived with the other man's wife, so we don't want each wife to go back to her real husband. Why? Because in the event that she's pregnant from the second man, then what's the status of that child? That child is a mamzer. If she goes back to her husband immediately, then we're not going to be able to tell who the pregnancy is from, which is going to lead us to the case of safek mamzeros. Therefore, I will say we have this concept in many situations of halacha called havchana. Havchana is a 3-month waiting period where where man and woman are not permitted to live with each other to make sure that if she is pregnant, again, because after 3 months we'll know if she's pregnant or not, that if she is pregnant, we know ultimately, again, who the child is. So why 3 months? Because remember, again, at 3 months is when a woman objectively begins to show. Remember, there's no pregnancy tests. So obviously, that's when a woman objectively begins. Obviously, some women could begin to show earlier, some women could begin to show later. But 3 months was the established time where a woman normally begins to show some external signs of pregnancy. Because remember, again, I will say, even if you want to say, well, again, isn't there another telltale sign that she's pregnant, which is, again, she won't menstruate. Right? She won't get a period. So remember again, in halacha, in order for the absence of menstruation to be a sign of pregnancy, you have to have a chazaka that she has stopped menstruating. When do you have a chazaka that she stopped menstruating? After 3 months. So either way, the 3-month period ultimately again is how long you're going to take to establish if she's pregnant or not. Vim hayu kitanos she'enon ru'uyos leilet. But again, let's say they were married to minor girls who ultimately are too young to become pregnant, machzirin osal miyad. Then Rabbi say what? Then they would be permitted to go back to their rightful husbands immediately, because again, there's no concern of pregnancy. Vim hayu kohanos, and if these women were kohanos, then what? Meaning bas kohanim. Then what? Nifsilu minat truma. They are no longer permitted to eat truma, and we'll discuss in the Gemara why that is. So says the Gemara, Huchlufu. So also, here's what's interesting. The lashon of the Mishnah is very strange, because what it says is Shnaim shekitchu shtei nashim b'shas knisas lechuppah hichlifu eshal zerabos. You know what this sounds like? It sounds exceptionally immoral. Hichlifu sounds like what? It's an intentional swap. So what are you talking about? The Gemara says hichlifu midi b'rishi askinon. Are we dealing with Rishaim who are literally engaging in this type of immoral activity? V'su hadatani Rabbi Chia Hari kan sheishes rechatos. Iba mezid. So I say, actually, you know what? We're going to stop over here for today. I know. I promise it'll get interesting tomorrow as well. So with the Gemara, so remember, we're just leaving off with the Kasha. The Gemara is bothered just by the verbiage of the Mishnah. Hechlifu, they exchanged, makes it sound like this was a willful act. How could it be that the Mishnah is talking about, again, such immoral individuals? We'll pick up with that in Mirat Hashem tomorrow.